We're going to talk about the hydroplate theory. Has anybody ever heard of that? Nobody's heard of that. Okay. All right. Well, it's developed by Dr. Walt Brown. He's a West Point grad, Army Ranger, paratrooper, got his PhD from MIT in mechanical engineering, and sharp guy, colonel in the Army, taught at the Air Force Academy. He ran the Benet Military Lab, where they had hundreds of scientists and dozens of PhDs, and he's the top dog. And so he's a really brilliant man. He's got really brilliant friends. And he's driving through South Dakota back 40-some years ago. And he hears on the radio back in the 1970s that somebody found Noah's Ark on a mountain. And he's an evolutionist. And he thought, an ark on a mountain, that's crazy. Anybody ever driven through South Dakota? There's not much to do but count down the wall drug signs, right? Okay. So he's got a lot of time. So he starts kicking this idea around in his head. So if there was an ark on a mountain, then that would mean everything below the ark was underwater. And that would mean that there was a worldwide flood. And that would mean that a whole bunch of plants and animals got buried in mud and turned into fossils. And he thought, wait a minute, if fossils are evidence for a flood, where's the evidence for evolution? And he started to ask his colleagues. He started to study it out. And after 2 years, he didn't get any evidence. He'd ask, what evidence is there for evolution? And he never got any. And then he came up with the hydroplate theory. So the Bible left clues in the Bible what it was like before the flood. And we'll finish up showing you some of those clues. And so he developed the hydroplate theory. And that theory is, basically when you develop a theory, you look at what we have and try and figure out how we got it. It's unknown. You look at the effects, which are known, and try and figure out the cause, which is unknown. This is different. He sets up the cause with only one assumption and lets the laws of physics go at it, determine the effects. And they both match our world perfectly. So the one assumption is that half of the water in the ocean was inside the earth at one time. Roughly 60 miles down, there was a layer of water. So just think of the earth as a big apple, and the skin's 60 miles thick, made of granite, and then there's a layer of water, roughly a mile thick, and then there's a layer of basalt. And the granite and the basalt are touching each other at certain places, okay? And that's the one assumption. And I talked to a college professor for an hour and a half about this. And we talked a lot about evolution, but then we talked about this theory, because their theory can't explain Grand Canyon. That's how it would open the door. And so she went through this theory, and she said, the science works if the assumption's true. I just don't believe the assumption is true. So what we're going to go through is scientifically valid according to a secular professor. Okay, so that's the one assumption. Now we throw in the laws of physics. You throw in the moon. The moon tugs on the earth twice a day, high tide, low tide, all right? Well, it does the same thing on the crust, tugs on the crust. But back then, before the flood, the crust wasn't broken into plates, like it is today. It was just the crust. So the crust would stretch and compress, stretch and compress, stretch and compress, and it generates heat. Like if I had a wire up here, go back and forth, it gets hot. You do it enough, it's going to break. Well, the crust is, pardon me? Okay, all right. The crust is getting hotter and hotter. It has to go somewhere, so it goes into the water. Water gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and it wants to boil, but there's no room to boil. It can't boil. And so at 705 degrees Fahrenheit and 3,200 psi, pounds per square inch, it becomes supercritical water. Okay, supercritical. And where it's not really water and it's not really steam, but whatever it is, it's under a tremendous pressure. And it's dissolving things like crazy. And it's starting to dissolve the crust and the basalt. And it's making these minerals like limestone and silica and salts in this subterranean water chamber. So it's getting hotter and hotter, warmer and warmer, and eventually something has to give. And the Bible tells us in Genesis 7:11, for in the 600th year of Noah's life, second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were open. So the fountains of the great deep broke up, and the water shot out with tremendous force. Just shot up with tremendous force. And when the crust cracked, that crack went in two directions at 3 miles per second and went around the world in 2 hours. Okay? And it just went around, and all the water just gushing out with tremendous force. And those are the minerals that it was, and so all that's coming up to the surface too. The limestone, the salt, and when stone forms, it releases some CO2. So there's CO2 down there. What's frozen CO2 called? Carbon dioxide. Dry ice, yeah. So all that stuff shoots out with tremendous force. You might say, okay, well, if that's the case, Brian, won't it leave a mark on the Earth? And the answer is yes, and it did. The mid-oceanic ridge. It's a 46,000-mile mountain range that goes around the bottom of every ocean. It's 800 miles wide. Okay, so it left a mark. And when you look in at that, when you zoom in, you notice it's got vertical cracks and horizontal cracks. Those are tension cracks, not compression, tension. So the question is, how do you form a 46,000-mile ridge by stretching it in two directions? There's the Atlantic. Again, it's got full of those tension cracks. This is the Indian Ocean. And notice that vertical line there. That's the 90 East Ridge. How did that form? And why is it pointed at the Himalayas? And this is the Pacific Ocean. They got 40,000 volcanoes at the bottom of it. This part of the ocean is very different than the rest of the ocean. Okay, so what's happening? All right, so you got the water gushing up. It's 260-mile cliffs. And you can only have a cliff 5 miles high on Earth before they start crumbling. It crushes the rock below. And these are 60 miles. So they're crumbling into this huge force that's throwing it up onto the surface. So the cracks are getting wider and wider and wider. And eventually there's nothing pushing down on the mantle. So the mantle bulges. Okay, this is where the mid-oceanic ridge comes from. It bulges right there. And as it bulges, the continents start to slide. Like if we had a train track and we lift one end, the train's going to start rolling if it's friction-free. Continents are pretty well friction-free around water. So they start going. And the farther they go, the less weight's there, so the higher the ridge goes. And that ridge is 800 miles wide. That's from here to St. Louis, plus another 150 miles. And so they start sliding. So you got Africa and Europe sliding to the right, or sliding to the east. You got North America and South America sliding to the west. And they're going to keep on going until they meet resistance. The water runs out or they hit another plate, and then they're going to buckle up. They're going to compress. And that's why the major mountain ranges are parallel to the mid-oceanic ridge. And so you got folded mountains. How do you fold layers of rock in a mountain? And you can go home and do a scientific experiment. Try and bend take your best piece of china and bend it 20 degrees. It's not going to bend. Rock does not bend. Those layers had to be soft when they were compressed. And that was on top. That was the sediment. This is the stuff of the granite. This is Gunnison Canyon in Colorado. And there's 15-foot trees on top of that just to give it the scale. That's how much force was going together. If anybody knows intrusion and extrusion stuff, it's amazing. Okay, so now you got a big mountain, big mass on a small base. What's got to happen? It sinks in. Okay, if something sinks in, something's got to rise up. That's why we got plateaus next to most of the mountains. The Tibetan Plateau by the Himalayas, you got the Columbia and the Colorado. That's the force that does it. Evolutionists can't explain that. So basically, it's gravity pulling the mountains down, and that breaks off chunks of the granite next to it, and that rises it up. Okay? And this is what happens. And then the lava's going to flow up, and it's going to get hard up there. And then if there's a big flow of water, like what happened when the Grand Canyon was formed, I do a whole other talk on that from this theory, it's going to wash away, not all of it, that got protected. And guess what we see? Red Butte. All that was sediment at one time. All that sediment had to get removed before the Grand Canyon was formed. And that's a whole other talk for another time. So now all this is that sediment sliding on the top, and then it buckles, right? So then it just gets sheared off. That's how you get flat layers on slanted layers in the Grand Canyon. That's what happened. Okay, so now the origin of sediments. You ever wondered why there's a mile of sediment on average on the continents? Where did that sediment come from? And if it doesn't have, if it's not organic, then it's 65 parts granite, 35 parts basalt. Isn't that interesting? And once you have the sediment on the continents, why would it turn to stone? Well, again, all that stuff's going down. It's falling into this flow of water, and then it's gonna distribute it across the continents. And then the waves are going to go across it, and liquefaction will sort them out into layers. But why would it turn into stone? Okay, I got a bunch of sand on my sidewalk. That's not turning into stone. It has to be mixed with a cementing agent. Remember that silica? Cementing agent. That's how we get all the sedimentary rock. So now you got the mid-oceanic ridge rising up. Okay, well, if something's rising up, something has to sink in this time. And that's the Pacific Ocean. Pacific Ocean sunk in. And right where the ring of fire is, There's a lot of friction. It melted a lot of granite. We have a lot of lava there. That's why there's so many volcanoes there. That's also why we got the deepest place on Earth, the Mariana Trench, 36,000 feet deep. It's deeper than Mount Everest is high. And why are all the trenches, nearly all of them, in the Pacific and not in the Atlantic? Well, this is why. They also found a continent called Zealandia that got sunk in. Okay, and they found fossils from land underneath the ocean. And Walt Brown had predicted that. Okay, so now you got the ocean just got deeper. So now the water that was covering the continent starts flowing into the ocean to fill up that void. And that's how the submarine canyons got formed. Most of the major rivers, the Ganges, the Congo, the Amazon, they got canyons underneath the ocean. Canyons don't cut under the ocean. That tells us that the continents were higher after the flood. And then the water came off, and the continents have sunk down a bit, and the oceans rose up a bit, and it filled in those canyons. Okay, they've got a mega canyon, like Grand Canyon, underneath Greenland, and there's not enough water flow for that to happen. How did that happen? And in Antarctica, they've got liquid lakes under 2 miles of ice. How does that happen? Okay, that brings us to the Ice Age. Now, evolutionists have about 40 theories for the Ice Age. None of them work. That's why there's so many. This one explains it perfectly. To get an Ice Age, you need warmer winters, so there's more precip, more rain coming down, and yet you need cooler summer. The rain will turn to snow as it gets higher in elevation. Warmer winters, cooler summers. How do you get that? Because if it's a cold winter, there's not going to be much precip. Okay, so how does that happen? Well, the oceans were warmer after the flood, hence more precipitation. Okay, but how do you get cooler summers? Well, the continents were higher elevations means it's cooler, more volcanic activity, that means there's more aerosols in the atmosphere blocking the sun's heat from getting to the earth. So it snows more than it melts year after year after year after year, and after about 500 years, you got a whole bunch of ice everywhere that is, except Siberia and Alaska. You look it up in Alaska, they never had a glacier. I saw that map and I was jumping up and down. It's hard to find a map of the glacier. And it's like, how in the world does a place that has permafrost today not have a glacier in the Ice Age? Well, it's because it was close to the coasts. The precip came down as rain and just flowed off. It had to get into the higher elevations for it to get snow. Okay, so you got the Ice Age, 500 years. And during that time, the ocean is cooling off, so less precip, less snow. And the atmosphere is clearing up, so now there's more heat coming through. So it took about 200 years for it to melt, the Ice Age. And they had a volcano, Mount Krakatoa, or whatever, back in the 18-whatevers. They had a year without summer. They had ice when they shouldn't have had, and it's because there were so many aerosols up there. Okay, now let's go back to the flood. This is a textbook. It says that South Pole mostly covered by ice, but fossils show that crocodiles, dinosaurs, and palm trees once lived in the land. How's that going to happen? Okay, if it's warmer, yeah, maybe crocodiles, maybe dinosaurs. But how do you get a palm tree when it's dark 4 months of the year? That's going to be tough. And how do you get up in Antarctica? They find badgers and shrews, people that live in permafrost. How's that going to live up there? They also found redwood stumps up there. Nothing grows up in that permafrost. How do you get a redwood stump up there? Okay? And they find all these animals, and they also found, it's a mammoth. Yeah, all right? Early technology. It's a mammoth. They found mammoths, and it wasn't a French one. But they found mammoths all over the place up there. They figured there was millions of them up there. And that one right here, very unusual, standing. Frozen in permafrost, standing up. It was buried alive. When things die, they tip over. How do you bury a mammoth? Flash freeze them. Any hunters here? Anybody shoot a deer? What's the first thing you do when you shoot them? You gut them. Yeah, you take the gut out, get the heat out of there, or it's going to spoil the meat. Well, this was flash frozen. You could still see what was in the stomach. And it had its summer vegetation in its mouth. And it had to be 150 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit to flash freeze it like that. That doesn't happen on Earth. Facts versus fiction about the mammoths. They are not Arctic animals, contrary to what they say. That's not wool on them. That's hair. And they eat way too much. They drink way too much. They can't survive up there. And then being in Minnesota, your little inch nose gets cold out there. Just think about 6 feet long. They're not going to live up there. And this is a picture of the leg that got crushed. If it just had pressure and there's nothing to the side, it would just snap and the pressure's released. But this must have been filled up with ice where it couldn't expand, and then the pressure just crushed it. So how does that happen? Okay, how did it get so fast, so cold during the summer? That's a tough one. How did the plants get the light, and how did it stay cold? So if those millions of mammoths are in temperate climate and they freeze, why wouldn't they thaw out? Okay, it's a two-part question. How did it get so cold so fast? That brings us to the big hail. Okay, cold hail. So the water shot up with such tremendous force that it broke out of our atmosphere, went up into the heat sink of outer space, got super cold. Remember carbon dioxide? What's that called? Dry ice. So you got mud and water and dry ice up there, and then the gravity is going to pull it back down. It rains down on these mammoths, freezes them solid, and it's not ice, it's muddy ice. It's like muddy hail, so it's not going to float. And it just buries them. And then other sediment comes across. I'm not sure how thick it was, but it didn't thaw out during the flood. And that heat went above, and so the big hail, that's what froze them. Okay, so now how come it didn't melt? You freeze them in a temperate atmosphere, why didn't it melt? Well, that brings us to the big roll. The mountains on the north are pretty much canceled out by the mountains on the south, in the southern hemisphere, except for the Himalayas. There's nothing that cancels out the Himalayas on the south. So you got this big mass on the north. Like if I had a spinning top and I dropped some glue on it, it's going to want to go to the side. So the Himalayas try to get to the side. And notice that 90 East ridge there, that vertical line, the world isn't round, it's got a bulge at the equator. And when the world shifted, it ripped it right there. And I'll show you how it shifted. Okay, so now you got the Himalayas. The Himalayas are up by the North Pole. Okay, the Himalayas are up there. The mammoths are in a temperate area where they got a lot of plants, a lot of animals, or a lot of water. And then the Himalayas are formed, and they try and get to the outside. So what happens? The stuff that was in temperate got brought up to where it's cold. Permafrost. All right? And that's how tropical palm tree got brought down into Antarctica. The big roll. And all these things, and this is an example of it. Let's see, is that, okay, yeah, so that the red dot represents the Himalayas. And it tries to go to the side, so therefore something from the side went to the top. And this is a big, broad brush of the foundation of this theory. It goes into a whole lot more, but this is the basics of it. And some people say objections, and I've talked to them at college. Oh, I don't believe there was water under the granite, under the ocean at one time. I don't believe there's water down there. And it's like, well, why not? There's water there today. Job wrote about it, or God asked, "Hast thou entered into the springs of the sea?" Springs of the sea, that was thousands of years ago, God wrote that. We didn't find those. They're the black smokers, the really hot water coming in from the bottom of the oceans. That means the water's below the ocean. And they didn't find them until 1977. So there's clues written throughout the Bible. And when you dig down, see, at 5 miles, everything should be so forced together so tightly that water can't get through. So there shouldn't be any water down there, especially if the earth was supposedly molten. But that's not what they find. It's the perfect seal. Russia's got a big, Germany's got one that's over 5 miles, and Russia's got one that's 7 miles. And they shouldn't find any water. But what do they find? They find crushed granite with water. Crushed granite with water. How does that happen? It goes way against their theory, and yet it's making perfect sense with this theory. And he's made about 50 predictions, and astounding predictions. And he made them right. He's accurate. Okay, he predicted that they'd find water under mountains, and he was right. Okay, so it's a neat theory. If this is true, is there any way to predict it? Well, yeah, predictions are the currency of science. And he said that not only was the water escaping our atmosphere, it was going at least 7 miles per second, so it escaped our gravitational pull. So you get all this water and mud and dry ice flowing out there. The bigger rocks are going to collect the other ones once they get away from the gravity of the earth. And you're going to have these things called dirty snowballs flying out there. Anybody heard what a dirty snowball is? Meteor, close. Comet, yeah. He says the comets came from Earth. And he made a prediction. He says, when we find out what's in a comet, we're going to find stuff from the Earth, like olivine. And he was right. And you say, well, if all that stuff shot out, wouldn't it leave a mark on the Earth, on the moon? And the answer is, yeah, it did. The near side of the moon has been pounded. The far side is not near as much, and that's counterintuitive because the Earth protects the moon on the near side. Anything coming to the near side might get sucked into the Earth by the physical part or by the gravity. So the far side should be pounded, but it's not. The near side has more moonquakes and more lava flows, and it looks like it's been shot with buckshot. And that came from the Earth, is what Walt Brown's theory predicts. And then he also predicted, and you get these peanut-shaped asteroids, and that shouldn't be happening. And you get these two asteroids out where they're going thousands of miles per second. They should just slam into each other and just go into smithereens. But they're not. They're peanut-shaped. They come together gradually. How does that happen? Well, they have to be going at the same direction, the same vector, the same force, and then gradually come together, and that's what happens. Anybody ever play pool? Yeah. Do the balls ever stick together? No. That's what's going to happen here. It just breaks everything apart. But if they're all going the same direction, away from the Earth's gravitational field, the bigger ones are going to sink. Are going to get the smaller ones together. And that's how you get the asteroids. And then you got two big ones, and they come together gently, peanut-shaped. And he also made a prediction that when we find out what are in asteroids, we're going to find that they're floating rock piles made of rounded boulders. All right? How do you get a rounded boulder in space? I mean, if things slam together, they're going to have sharp edges. The only way you get a rounded boulder is if it's going through a fast flow of water before it gets shot up into outer space. And so he's making these astounding predictions. The next one is, he said, mining meteors will be a waste of money, because he says those came from the Earth too. You know, the Bible said that, you know, everything was very good. Is it good to have a comet that's going to crush America someday? But they call those dinosaur eggs. And then some of the asteroids have moons. And he's predicted that too. And that's really hard to get a moon. You know, if they're coming together, it's either going to slam into it or it's going to do a slingshot around it. They have to be going just almost perfect for a moon to come around. And so these are some of the predictions that he's made. Pooled water under mountains, deep channels under the Gibraltar, salt on Mars, asteroids are flying rock piles, and he's been right on all these. Water inside large asteroids, rocks and asteroids, and comets are rounded. Carbon-14 and old bones. We'll talk about that tonight with our dinosaur talk. These are the verses, these are the clues in the Bible that helped him put this together. This is Psalm 104, 5 through 9. Who laid the foundations of the earth that it should not be removed forever? Thou covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At thy rebuke they fled. At the voice of thy thunder they hastened away. The voice of thy thunders. Can you imagine what it sounded like when those mountains were forming? Oh my goodness. And some people will say, well, this is the creation account. Well, keep reading. They go up by the mountains, they go down by the valleys unto the place where thou hast founded them. Thou hast set a bound that they may not pass over, that they may turn not again to cover the earth. Well, if this is the creation or the event, then God lied, because the water covered the earth again. This is the flood event. And then he gave another. The waters compassed me about, even to the soul. The depths closed round me. This is in Jonah. Closed me round about. The weeds were wrapped about my head, and I went down to the bottom of the mountains. Bottom of the mountains. How do they know that there were mountains in the ocean if they weren't inspired? This is Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. So the earth was under water at one time. Okay, and God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear, and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and he gathered together the waters of the seas, and God saw that it was good. So this is what's happening on the third day. To him that stretched out the earth above the waters, for his mercy endures forever. Stretched out the earth above the waters. And so this mechanical engineer is looking at that and believing it. And the earth and the inhabitants thereof are dissolved. I bear up the pillars of it. The pillars of the earth. And Psalm 33. By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them. By the breath of his mouth he gathered the waters of the sea together as a heap, and laid them up in the depths of storehouses. Gathered them up in a heap in storehouses. And so Walt Brown is putting that together. There are subterranean water chambers. Those were the fountains of the great deep. It's just amazing. He had founded it upon the seas and established it upon the floods. And he just keeps putting these together. Yeah, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, at the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up. They say, well, where'd the water come from for the flood? You know, it can't rain that much. You know, if it rains that much to cover the earth, it's going to get too hot, and it's going to destroy everything. Well, the Bible doesn't say the water came from rain. It says it rained 40 days, but it says the fountains of the great deep were broken up. So that's how it could rain for 40 days, and yet the water keeps going up. And I think that's when there was so much water above the fountain that it couldn't break through. And then it just kept rising and rising until 150 days, and then it dissipated after the Pacific Ocean sunk in. That's how I interpret it. And who shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth, as if issued out of the womb? Job 38:8. It just gushed out of there. So there are these clues. Walt Brown put them together, and I think he's right. And this is just the tip of this theory. I do a whole other talks on the origin of radioactivity. You know, is it very good for the Earth to have uranium that can cause birth defects? No. He thinks that the radioactive material came when the continents were sliding together. And he goes into, that's a whole nother talk I do on Grand Canyon answers. The key to Grand Canyon is bulging and cracking. You know, we talked about how it bulged and then the mantle did. Same thing happened at Grand Canyon. When Red Butte, all that stuff was going away, there was the Coconino sandstone that got washed all that, and there's less weight, and it cracked, and then the water went through there. That's how you get that inner gorge. That's how you get Marble Canyon. They're way different than Grand Canyon. And yeah, the Grand Canyon's got some unanswered questions, and that's what opens the door to a geologist. Okay? They know they don't have a theory that explains Grand Canyon. None of them work. You know, my brother-in-law was taking a geology class at St. Cloud State, and he said for a week they tried to figure out Grand Canyon. None of them worked. Then on Friday, the professor says, you know, we looked at all the theories except one. Anybody know what it is? Kid raised his hand and said, Noah's flood. And it got real quiet in the room. And the professor says, you know, you're right, but we can't talk about it. Not the freedom to think. And that's what inspires me to get up and I'm just cracking the door open for you. A lot of my talks are on YouTube, Solidify Your Faith. Go in and check them out. I've got a website called solidifyyourfaith.webs.com. Check that out. And I had a big passion to get Creation Club started on campus. And I've done it 3 times. 2 Bible clubs and, 2 Bible clubs and a Creation Club at state universities, while the Creation one's private. And now my goal is to help start Creation Clubs in every community. And there's a brochure in the back. Grab one of them. All you need is somebody who understands and a place to meet. I contacted a lot of creation movie producers and asked them if we could show their movies without a license. And there's a list of the producers that say, yeah, go ahead. Because this is a battle. This is a big battle. We've got a couple of minutes left. This is a new theory for you. Anybody have any questions? Anybody? It's kind of a lot to process right now. Walt Brown is my favorite scientist. You know, I think he's going to go down as today's Isaac Newton. One of my favorite websites is rsr.org, where it's Bob Enyart. He's been on the radio for 20-some years. He's actually a pastor, too. And he has these creation scientists come in and he interviews them. So if I want to find out about soft tissue, I'll go on rsr.org, soft tissue, dinosaur tissue. And they've got the most comprehensive list of soft tissues found in dinosaur. And an atheist said that. And if you want to see this hydroplate theory, you can buy the stuff from rsr.org. And if you want to see it itself, you can go to hpt.rsr.org, and you can see a flip book of this theory. It's in the 9th edition, and it's in the process of getting printed. So the 8th edition is getting really valuable right now. But there's changes there. And yeah, the hydroplate theory. It just makes everything fit, and yet the evolutionists don't like that. And sometimes science, Bob Enyart said, he said, science advances one funeral at a time. Right? Because if you have a lot of power and prestige and money involved in evolution or plate tectonics or catastrophic plate tectonics, you don't want some new thing kicking you off the top of the mountain. And that's what's starting to happen. Because I just saw just this past summer in Creation Matters, it's part of, you see, Creation Research Quarterly, Creation Research, it's a newsletter. They had the write-up on the 3 flood models, and they included the hydroplate. And so I'm thinking that the dam of censorship is starting to crack. And as more people find out about it and start asking about it, I think we're gonna see the truth. And then if we'd have been pounding beating this drum for the last 3 or 4 decades, you know how much scientific clout we'd have right now? All these astounding predictions. I mean, we'd have a lot of clout. And so with that, any questions? Any concerns? All right, let's end in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father.